Welcome to, I guess, day 2 of our Network Leadership Forum, and to anyone who's watching on live stream, welcome to them as well. So this morning, we're going to talk about populism. We're going to talk about it comparatively around the world, and we're going to talk about it in the United States as well. I think that's what my colleague Frank Fukuyama wants to focus on. I hope in this short presentation to give you a sense of how this is appearing and evolving around the world, what it means for democracy around the world, and what populism is, although it's a term that now gets invoked so frequently that it's come to mean almost everything. I just want to preface what I'm going to say by reminding everyone that we are in a period which has been going on, I think, for more than 10 years now, that has been challenging for democracy because the global progress of democracy has leveled off during this period, and the incidence of democracy and levels of freedom in the world have been declining. This decline has accelerated in the last 2 to 3 years. And I personally think this is an important reason why. Illiberal populism doesn't have to mean the demise of democracy, but it certainly challenges the quality of democracy. And the problem is that illiberal populists, because of the intrinsic nature of populism, carry with them the risk of sliding into an authoritarian path. This is certainly what has happened in Venezuela and in Turkey and in some other countries we'll talk about. So here I present 4 individuals, three of them democratically elected to the leadership of government in their country, so 2 presidents and a prime minister, and 1 near president who may very well be president soon. The one on the top is Jacob Zuma, who is the president of South Africa. Then on the right, in the upper right corner, is a man who I think has become infamous in the last 15 months since he assumed the presidency of the Philippines, Rudy Duterte, who's a kind of anti-drugs crusader who has presided over the extrajudicial execution of more than 8,000 people, some human rights advocates and monitors in the Philippines believe the number is even twice that. In the lower right corner and on the right side of the lower right corner, of course, is the Prime Minister of Hungary. And in the lower left corner is the nearly elected president of Peru, that is still a member of the Parliament of Peru, but almost elected president, the daughter of the former authoritarian ruler of Peru, Keiko Fujimori. I want to call particular attention to Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, because of all the illiberal populists who populate electoral politics these days around the world, I think he's one of the most interesting, significant, and troubling figures, in part because of his extraordinary political skill at mobilizing illiberal sentiments and at concentrating power and gradually dismantling democracy in ways that are so subtle and so sophisticated and so manipulative of institutional rules that even Freedom House, in what I think is one of the greatest analytic errors it's made in recent years, still classifies Hungary as an electoral democracy. This is a man, of course, who has been very anti-immigrant, very abusive of minorities in general, including the Gypsy population there, but he has manipulated anti-Semitism by attacking George Soros, who is of Hungarian descent, the wealthy now American financier, and of course supporter probably of some of you in the Soros Foundation and of democratic development around the world. And we want to be careful analytically to distinguish two things. One is populism, which I promise you I'm going to define before this short presentation ends. And the other is creeping authoritarianism, what is now called, kind of an unfortunate phrase in political science, authoritarianization, kind of a parallel to democratization. But that is the process by which elected leaders, whatever their nature, concentrate power, diminish constraining rules and institutions, the judiciary, the media, civil society, even frankly the private sector. Eric actually spoke to some of this in terms of the rule of law recession yesterday, because the diminution of the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary is an important element of this, and thereby concentrate so much power in their own hands that nobody can challenge them any longer. When this process advances, it always, on the path to authoritarianism, attacks the electoral system and the structure of electoral administration as well, because of course, an important element of this is the leader and the ruling party barricading themselves in power so that they cannot be easily electorally held accountable or turned out of office in future elections. And Orban has done this as well by means that some of you probably have keen familiarity with, including compromising the independence of electoral administration, but also rewriting the electoral districts and the apportionment in ways that have systematically disfavored the opposition. So this kind of trend of creeping authoritarianism is one thing. It may be authored by an elected ruler who is populist in nature, and in principle it could be authored by someone who really isn't populist but is authoritarian in spirit. It's hard for me to make a clear decision in my own mind as to how to characterize the gentleman in the lower right picture on the left side, who is, of course, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. I don't think he is a populist in the sense that he's not really anti-establishment. I mean, come on, look at his history. He came up through the establishment and is a product of, as we know, the KGB, and then the elite that reproduced itself after the fall of communism. But he has played on themes that have populist elements, as you will see. Okay, we move on. One of the things that's very worrisome to me in terms of the fate of democracy in the world, the trajectory of democracy in the world, is I think we are seeing new, continuing, and evolving forms of populism in many countries, including developing countries that were thought to be pretty strong, pretty vigorous, pretty resilient democracies. This gentleman, Mr. Batulga, who is the longtime head of the National Judo Association in Mongolia, was recently elected president of Mongolia. And he is, by the way, pro-Putin. I'd say that's something you find with a lot of the illiberal populists that are arising in developing and post-communist countries. They're either pro-Putin, like Viktor Orban, or they're pro-Chinese, like President Duterte in the Philippines. And often that's not a coincidence. There's speculation at a minimum that some of these individuals are getting financing from the authoritarian countries in question. But in any case, what prompts a country like Mongolia that has had 20 years of pretty vigorous democracy and for a time one of the highest economic growth rates in the world to choose somebody from the business community with a populist narrative and no previous involvement in politics? So I think maybe you may be seeing a parallel here, kind of a public notoriety from another sector, and in this case not only business but sports, to choose someone like that to lead the country. And obviously there's something that leads people to be dissatisfied with the political order and rejecting of the existing political elite. And I will say that one big thing that motivated Mongolian voters was rising levels of corruption in the country that are really extremely toxic and have not been effectively addressed. And then when you have, as a result of a hard minerals boom and the rising demand from China, explosive economic growth and benefits kind of being spread all around the country, and suddenly as a result of the economic slowdown in China, an economic crash and implosion, an end to that fabulous growth, and then austerity and slowdown in payment of wages and bonuses and so on to state employees, a deep recession in the economy. Someone like this is, relatively advantaged in making an appeal as an outsider. And that is a clue to, I think, something important about populism. Populists present themselves as critics of some establishment, of elites in general, and at least position themselves as outsiders even if they're not. This is someone I want you to bear in mind in terms of watching what happens in world politics, and now specifically in Latin American and Brazilian politics. Our Latin American participants here may be aware of this individual, a longtime member of the Chamber of Deputies in Brazil. His name is, I may not pronounce the Portuguese perfectly, but I think it's Jair Bolsonaro. This man is an extreme right-wing, illiberal personality who is so contemptuous of liberal rights, human rights, gay rights, women's rights, that he has been called something like, I don't have the notes in front of me, the most misogynistic and illiberal elected official anywhere in the world. He is a former military officer who has defended and even justified the human rights violations under military rule in Brazil, which ended in 1985, and who is claiming to provide an answer, an antidote, an alternative to a political class in Brazil, which, if you've been reading the news out of Brazil, with the process that led to the impeachment and removal from office of President Dilma Rousseff, and which almost led, and frankly, if the rule of law was vigorous in Brazil, should have led, I think, to the impeachment and removal from office of her successor, the Senate president, who, by the way, Eric, is a professor of constitutional law as well in Brazil. So it's not like there's any immunity from temptation and bad governance that results from being a law professor. Michel Temer. In any case, when you have one scandal after another, and when the prosecutions and investigations reveal as systemic, gross, and indulgent and kleptocratic a pattern of self and party enrichment as has prevailed in Brazil and as has been spilling across the social media and the television broadcasts and the newspaper accounts, as has been the case in Brazil, it's tempting for people to turn to an outsider who promises a strong hand, who they may be fearful of in some ways, but at least they know he's not going to be corrupt. And if you understand now what I've been saying with some of these people, you see that I think there is a recurrent pattern here in terms of the rise of illiberal populism with at least authoritarian potential and authoritarian instincts. And the fertile soil for this is bad governance, a perception of widespread corruption and inefficacy on the part of democracy or the established institutions, and a sense, to put it most concisely, that there is a political class in the country, not just the politicians, but people who interact with and circle around the politicians, who are all detached from the people, don't care about the interests of the people, and are just tending to their own well-being. Now, one of the things that is most disturbing to me as a democracy scholar, and I think to us at CDDRL, is, as I've already alluded to with the case of Viktor Orban in Hungary, this dynamic seems to be mutating among the advanced industrial democracies of the world. And so we have seen its growth and energy within the European Union. And of course, Hungary is a member of the European Union, and so is Poland, where, what was it now, I think a couple years ago, the PIS, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, and its leader, though he doesn't hold formal elective office, former Prime Minister Kaczynski, represent a culturally extremely conservative and pretty virulent form of illiberal populism. And again, we see a pattern, not yet as advanced in Poland institutionally as it has become in Hungary, but only because the Law and Justice Party didn't win as commanding a legislative majority in Poland as Orban did in Hungary, so they weren't able to rewrite the constitutional rules as thoroughly. But it's anti-immigrant, anti-minority, anti-liberal values, certainly very culturally conservative, so it aligns itself with the church and so on, and is behaving in a way that is very intolerant of criticism and dissent in the media. And then, of course, this has provoked in Poland, which you know the history of Poland, I think, with its mass protests and vigorous anti-authoritarian underground movement in the 1980s, and so that culture still continues. It provoked mass street protests, which I think helped to contain this authoritarian drift and to stimulate a more vigorous response on the part of the European Union. Fortunately, this type of political phenomenon, as represented in France by Marine Le Pen, who I am not suggesting would have led France or might someday lead France in the same authoritarian direction or to the same authoritarian degree as Orban and Law and Justice in Poland have done in their respective countries, but it certainly got some worrisome elements to it in terms of its attitude toward immigrants and to certain liberal values. Fortunately, in my view, as a democracy scholar, she lost the election for the French presidency. But, you know, her party, the National Front, won a lot of support, and I think it's now widely understood that if another outsider who did win, who also had, I'd say, a touch of populism, because he ran as an outsider with some criticism of the establishment. So if Emmanuel Macron does not succeed in addressing some of the issues, economic and also in a way immigration, that the National Front was raising, it's not me saying this now, it's the French ambassador to the United States saying this in the immediate wake of Macron's victory. She could be president 5 years from now. And then I don't only want to suggest that populism, as we're seeing it evolve in the advanced industrial world and also in the developing and post-communist worlds, is exclusively a phenomenon of the right. It can be a phenomenon of the left as well. And I'd say the government of Greece, led by Prime Minister Tsipras, the Syriza government is an example, I'd say, of a left form of populism, rather close to, and I'd say sympathetic to Putin, by the way. And then you have Podemos in Spain, which has been growing in influence as the traditional left-of-center party. The Socialist Party has declined in influence. So now let me try and define then what is populism and what is illiberal populism. I think that the core features of populism, and they don't have to be illiberal, but they have a tendency in that direction. The core features of populism are, first of all, anti-elitist. They involve a very broad indictment of prevailing elites in society, economic elites. I think increasingly in terms of the version of populism that we're seeing, intellectual elites, and it's very important to appreciate that, political elites, of course. In that sense, I'm going to skip the anti-pluralism and come back to that. It's anti-institutionalist. It's basically saying there's something wrong with the prevailing institutions. They're kind of rigged in favor of the elites, and therefore they need to be reformed in a certain way. Then it's plebiscitary. Now, plebiscitary is an adjective, the root of which is plebiscite. What's a plebiscite? It's not representative democracy. It's a direct popular vote, right? And a plebiscitary leader is one who says, we need to bypass this mediated relationship between representatives and the people. And populist political leaders seek a direct relationship between themselves, or maybe their parties, and the people, the legitimate people of society who are not corrupted in the way that elite, self-serving, and arrogant elites are. So it tends to favor direct over representative democracy, and by the way, that is why populists so frequently organize referenda and even bypass parliamentary procedures. So in this respect, it has some hegemonic tendencies, even if it's not illiberal and even if it doesn't wind up drifting in an authoritarian direction. Because if you're saying that the existing elites are all corrupt, arrogant, dismissive of the people, in some sense undeserving of the status they have, that you represent something purer, better, more just, fair, more representative of the real interests of the real people, there is an implicit message there that you're delegitimizing other actors and saying you are better, and maybe they're not so legitimate, and maybe they really shouldn't be on the same plane or listen to as carefully, and then you can see the potential for a slide in an authoritarian direction. Now you graft onto that some of these other features, and it does get, I'd say, very dangerous to democracy. So the second element is anti-pluralist. That means challenging, questioning, and contemptuous of difference in society. And this can be ethnic difference, social difference, lifestyle difference, but it can also be political difference. Well, if you don't agree with us, our party, our platform, maybe you're not really loyal to the country. And you're certainly, you're certainly part of the problem of the corrupt elite that ruined the country, bankrupted it, made you poor, caused the economic recession, allowed all these dirty immigrants to come into the country. And the real authoritarian populists, like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who's, I'd say, one of the original ones, the late Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, and I'd say one of the most skillful and dangerous of our time, Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, have manipulated these narratives in a really, really brilliant and devilish way. So anti-pluralism is an enemy of certainly liberal democracy, but I'd say generally of democracy, because pluralism is one of the core foundations of democracy. And then finally we come to the last two elements, which enables me to then hand over to Frank. If you're anti-pluralist, it's kind of another way of saying, or an easy path to being illiberal, and not just suspicious of difference, but downright intolerant of it, of religious difference, of ethnic difference, and so on. And that really begins to pave the path into authoritarianism. We could locate here from an earlier era, long since deposed, Prime Minister Thaksin of Thailand, who I do not justify the military coup that toppled him, and the military coup in 2014 in Thailand that toppled his sister and successor, Yingluck Shinawatra. But many people in Thailand were worried that Thaksin was they didn't know that Orban was going to be like this, that Erdogan was going to be like this, but that he was on such a roll in terms of mobilizing the people and delegitimizing the opposition that Thailand would cease to be a democracy and that they'd never be able to dislodge him from power. So it tends to be a very polarizing phenomenon as well. And finally, in recent years, it's taken on a very hyper-nationalist and anti-globalist, anti-free trade, anti-immigration, and in some ways isolationist flavor as well. And that's what enables me now to turn over to my distinguished colleague, Professor Fukuyama.
Well, I'd like to thank my distinguished colleague, Larry Diamond, but I'm going to talk about populism in the developed world. Larry touched on this, but I think it's important to distinguish actually between things that get labeled populism, because I think that there's some serious differences. So one important point to begin with is that it's true that populism is anti-elitist. In fact, I've often thought that populism is just a label that elites give to anything they don't like, and there's something to that. And there's also been a little bit of a presumption that the elites kind of know what they're doing, and therefore the populists are, wrong in some sense. But that's actually not the case, and elites screw up. And I think that one of the reasons that you have populism in both the United States and in Europe is that there have been some really big elite mistakes over the past couple of decades that have gotten a lot of people angry. So the core of the analysis, I think, is a fairly familiar one, and it has to do with globalization and the global economy. The United States, since the end of World War II, along with its allies, Britain, the rest of NATO Europe, have promoted what's called a liberal international order, meaning an economic component, free trade, movement of people, capital, ideas, goods, services across international borders, and then a political liberal order, which is underpinned by America's different military alliances, the NATO alliance, the US-Japan, US-South Korea security treaties, and the like. And that system overall has worked brilliantly. So in terms of, so if you take an international trade theory course, it will tell you that a system of, reduced tariff barriers, free trade, will maximize everybody's income, and this happened. This happened at an aggregate level. So between 1970 and 2008, the crisis in 2008, global output quadrupled. 4 times as much goods and services were produced by the global economy. So people got incredibly rich. The thing that the trade theory should also tell you that people didn't pay as much attention to is that while each country participating in this system gets richer in aggregate, not everybody in every country gets richer. And in fact, what's happened is that you've had the rise of very large, hundreds of millions of people entering the middle class in China, in India, in Latin America, in other parts of the developing world, including Africa. But a lot of that has come at the expense of former middle classes and working class people in developed countries. There's a lot of production. Manufacturing has moved, especially to Asia, but to other areas in the world. There's a very interesting IMF report that came out about a month ago. So a lot of the, like Piketty and other people have looked at, aggregate income distribution, but this was looking at what happened to people in the middle of the distribution in the course of the last 20 years in the United States, and it's really amazing. So 50% of Americans are no richer than they were in the year 2000, in 2016. So 16 years have not produced any economic growth. A very small number of people in the middle moved up into the upper income brackets, and a very significant number of people moved downwards into relative poverty or losing that middle class status that they thought they had. And this, I think, was the basic economic driver of a lot of the anti-globalization that occurred, that had to do, so why did Donald Trump get elected president of the United States? It's not that more Americans voted for him. As we know, 2.8 million more Americans voted for Hillary Clinton than for Donald Trump, but he got elected because of 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where enough working class voters who had voted reliably for Democratic candidates in the previous 2 elections voted for Donald Trump because they were, essentially upset by this economic, the deindustrialization that had taken place. In general, the core, and by core I mean this is probably no more than about 35% of the total American electorate, hardcore Trump voters are working class, less educated. One of the strongest correlations is population density. One of our colleagues at Stanford, Jonathan Rodden, has done this very interesting study that shows that the single tightest correlation in who voted for Donald Trump is whether you live in a big city or not. So Hillary Clinton got all of her votes in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and capital cities of even red states. But if you lived out in less populated rural areas, you tended to vote for Donald Trump. Very similar to the Brexit vote in Britain, where Greater London voted overwhelmingly to remain, and it was the smaller cities, more rural people, less educated, older voters that tended to vote to leave the European Union. So that was part of it. But this is where I think you have to distinguish between left-wing and right-wing populism. Larry mentioned that you've got Podemos and Syriza in Spain and Greece, and the whole Latin American wave of populism, Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, Rafael Correa, and so forth. That's different because the social basis of the left-wing populism is more traditional poor versus rich. In Latin America, you never had a really broad middle class with a small number of very rich people and a relatively small number of very poor people, which was the situation in much of the industrialized world. And so there, populism is left-wing because you got a lot of poor people and you got relatively concentrated wealth, and you vote for left-wing parties that want to redistribute wealth. That was what Chavismo was all about, and that's really what the Southern European populist parties want to do. The right-wing populism that's new is not based on people at the bottom of the income distribution. It's really based on people in the kind of lower part of the middle who have been moving downwards as a result of technological change, globalization, and so forth. And this is where the economic change gets mixed up with identity politics because so this is a general observation about the relationship between economics and politics that my mentor Samuel Huntington pointed out a long time ago, that the most dangerous class politically is oftentimes not poor people, people at the bottom of the distribution. It's middle-class people who are losing status because they're the ones that, they have more wealth and education so that they can do more politically. They're not just trying to survive day to day. They're easy to mobilize, and they get very angry at that loss of relative status, and that's really what's been happening. So if you talk to a lot of Trump voters, they will tell you that they voted for Donald Trump because he is the first politician that seemed to be listening to them, that actually seemed to understand their situation. And in that, I think they're actually correct. Neither the Republicans nor the Democrats actually paid attention to this working class vote. The Democrats actually, their coalition since the 1930s had included a lot of working class voters. That was the New Deal coalition that Franklin Roosevelt put together. But they've been defecting to the Republicans increasingly over the years. It started with Ronald Reagan, and it was sufficient to put Donald Trump over the top. But the Republicans, so why is that the case? On the Democrat side, it's because the Democratic Party has interpreted its progressive mission in identity terms. And so if you look at the webpage of the Democratic Party, they list like 15 different groups. So it's African Americans, women, Hispanics, the LGBT community, so on and so forth, as the people that they're supporting. The one identity group that's really not identified as a separate group is this old white working class, and they're the ones that felt ignored by their traditional political home, the Democratic Party. The Republicans were not representing them either. Up till now, the Republican Party has been dominated by business interests, the Chamber of Commerce that wanted business-friendly policies, low taxes, cut the welfare state, cut social services in order to pay for, essentially tax cuts for wealthy people. And so these people felt, they had been abandoned by both parties. There was some degree of truth to that, and that is what I think Trump was capitalizing on. And so that's why you get this mixture of economic grievance with identity. And I think this is where it gets a little bit complicated as to why we're in the current situation we're in. Because the left had started to identify inequality not as broad socioeconomic inequality, but as inequality tied to particular identity groups, it began to drift off into a very strange, world in which these identity groups saw themselves as cultural entities that were kind of self-contained. And so in a certain sense, the anti-pluralism that Larry is talking about sort of had a home on the left as well. I mean, we have this, the more extreme versions of this that you see on American college campuses takes the form of things like the attack on cultural appropriation. So what is that? That means that you cannot speak about somebody else's culture unless you come from that culture. So if you want to run a Mexican restaurant in Seattle and you're white, you're not allowed to do that because that's appropriating somebody else's culture. There was a little bit of this in the Black Lives Matter. So the Black Lives Matter movement was driven by real injustice. There is a lot of police brutality in the United States, but some of the more extreme proponents of that movement said, if you're not black, you can't be part of this movement in a sense because you can't understand our feelings and our particular pain because you are not part of our cultural group. And so this kind of stuff has been evolving on the left. You see it, in the new campus activism that's been apparent at Stanford and many other American schools. So I'm writing a book right now, or actually I've just finished the book on all of this, on identity politics. So if you want to know what the core of identity politics is, it's all about dignity and recognition, right? That people don't just want material goods. Of course, they're selfish individuals. They want to have good incomes and salaries and cars and nice houses, but they're also very much concerned with their recognition as human beings by other people. And that is really what's driving a lot of the political movements. There's good forms of it. So the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, the Arab Spring, these were all movements for dignity. Governments that were not recognizing the basic humanness of their populations. That's what authoritarian governments do. And at its base, democracy is about dignity. It's about a system that grants rights to participation to citizens on an equal basis. But one of the big problems in existing liberal democracies is that that kind of minimal dignity that is afforded by a liberal political system is not enough for a lot of people. Because, in fact, there's social discrimination, there is marginalization because of who you are, because of your race, because of your gender, because of a lot of characteristics that exist, that continue to exist in liberal democracies, and this generates a demand for recognition of people's dignity, dignity attributed to their culture, to their background. People want to, feel good about themselves. This is, if you think about the gay rights movement or the gay marriage movement, it's not just about economics. If the only issue involved in gay unions was things like survivorship, inheritance, what happens, if a gay partner dies, you can accommodate that through a civil union. There's a lot of legal things that are not the equivalent of marriage, but the reason that the gay marriage movement was so powerful was that it was about not economics, but about dignity. That gay people wanted to say, our union deserves as much respect as a heterosexual union, and that's what really powered the passion behind it. So a lot of liberal politics has been devoted to raising the perceived dignity, the recognition that marginalized groups have received in existing liberal societies. So there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing, it's a very powerful, I think, inherent part of the human psychology to demand this kind of dignity and recognition. But the way it's evolved in many liberal societies has resulted in this turn away from universal recognition of people as citizens of a democratic society to the recognition of cultural groups that increasingly regard themselves as closed off and whose experiences are unique and really can't be shared among other people. So all of this gets picked up on the right in the United States. Every stupid thing that happens on an American campus, is then publicized on Fox News. And you have these working class white people who have lost their jobs. There's a huge opioid epidemic in the United States, broken families, they're living in crumbling neighborhoods, and they say to themselves, all of these blacks, women, gays, all of them can mobilize and talk about themselves as a persecuted minority. What's wrong with us white people thinking of ourselves in this fashion? And so one of the really disturbing things that's happened over the past year or so is the much more explicit rise of white nationalism. So if you followed what happened in Charlottesville, whatever it is, a month or 6 weeks ago, these people had their first national rally. All these people came armed with semi-automatic weapons, marched into Charlottesville to protect these Confederate statues. Donald Trump, instead of condemning this very forcefully, was very equivocal and said, well, there's violence and hatred on both sides, and he has never officially endorsed this kind of view, but he's been very tolerant of it. And the people in this movement have picked up that signal. And in fact, after he failed to condemn them very explicitly, David Duke, one of the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan, said, well, thank you, Donald Trump. We got your message. We understand what you're saying. So anyhow, this is kind of the toxic stew, I think, that has been brewing in the United States. And I think that the elites, one of the things they don't quite understand is how this identity politics is playing out and why Trump continues to be very popular among his hardcore supporters. Because well, actually, it's since General Kelly took over as his chief of staff, things have calmed down a little bit, because obviously he's been telling Trump to lay off of Twitter. But up until that point, virtually every week you'd say, okay, Trump has said something that no president could possibly say, and then the next week he'd say something even more outrageous. And, people like me and Larry, and I think most of the people in this room would say, this is just horrible. How can a president say all these misogynistic, stupid, incautious things? But I think what they don't realize is that, breaking these boundaries of political correctness is actually what makes him attractive to a lot of people. The fact that he's not willing to observe these rules and norms about things that you can and can't say that are perceived attacks on the dignity of different groups is actually what cemented his support among this core group of supporters. And so I think that this is, so I guess where are we? Just to wrap up a little bit, I think that Trump shares a lot of the characteristics of populist leaders in other parts of the world. In addition to Larry's list, I would say there's a couple of other things that characterize populism. One is support for social programs that are popular in the short run but are disastrous in the long run because they're not sustainable. And Trump actually advocated that in the course of his campaign. Once he was elected president, he backed away from a lot of that, but he continues to not completely buy into the Republican attack on the welfare state. The second is the general anti-elitism that he's got. And the third, Larry put it in terms of anti-institutionalism. You could also put it in terms of a cult of the leader, where the populist leader says, I'm the one that understands your feelings, and we don't need the rest of the elite and institutions in order to fix the problem. And that describes Trump to a T. So some of you in this 2016 class were there. We all watched the Republican National Convention together when he accepted the nomination. And if you remember what he said, I alone understand your problems, and I alone can fix them, right? So this is almost the textbook definition of, charismatic populism, and that's the way I think he's conceived of himself. So he has been this very interesting experiment in institutions. As a citizen, I'm completely horrified that we elected this guy president. As a political scientist, it's actually been a pretty interesting experiment because it's not over. But, you know, as our colleague Bruce Kane said, the American founding fathers designed the Constitution with lots of checks and balances precisely to deal with someone like Donald Trump. The possibility that you'd elect a president like Donald Trump. They were very well versed in classical history. They were aware of the reasons for the downfall of the Roman Republic, the rise of Julius Caesar, who used a similar kind of populist appeal to come to power as a great general and leader, strongman. And so they wanted to create checks and balances in order to stop that kind of accumulation of power on the part of the executive. I would say basically that the system is working, fairly well. Donald Trump tried to attack a whole range of American institutions: the judiciary, the entire intelligence community, the civil service, more broadly, the mainstream media, which at one point he says is the enemy of the American people. You really have to go back to Stalin or someone like that to find a leader that made an assertion, quite on that level. But I think that actually most of those institutions up till now have held. He's really largely failed in any of his big efforts to get rid of Obamacare. I doubt he's going to get funding for this wall, to keep Mexicans out as we proceed down the road. But in a certain sense, I don't think the danger, his presidency is not played out. He could actually succeed if the economy does well. He could get lucky in foreign policy. I mean, there's a number of things that could happen that would actually get the Republicans reelected next year and could get him reelected in 2020. I think for the time being, in my view, we're kind of saved by the fact that he's so incompetent, that he just seems to have this psychological need to be raucously affirmed by this very narrow 30% of the American population. If he had been a more clever populist, he would have started his administration by reaching out to Democrats on issues that they would have supported, like infrastructure. And, in a way, that's what Ronald Reagan did in the early days of his presidency. That's why he was a tremendously transformational president. Trump, didn't figure this out. Maybe he's moving towards that, because he's finding that his fellow Republicans are so hard to work with. But in the absence of that, I think, his ability to change the American, to change policy very dramatically are limited. The things I worry about in the long run are more institutional things, so that, for example, we've never, ever had a president with this level of conflict of interest, who basically is enriching himself, as a businessman as he's president of the United States. And that's a norm that has not been violated up till now, but it's pretty egregious. Weakening of, judicial norms, although they've held this idea that a president should just be able to fire or replace an attorney general that's not doing his bidding, is something I don't think we've seen in certainly my political memory. And all of these things may, come back in a much more dangerous form, either, later on in his administration or down the road at some point. So we're open now to questions and comments. So I guess we'll collect them again. Okay, Labus.
Thank you very much. I have a question probably for Larry about political systems and how political systems, looking comparatively at all these contexts that you've studied, if there's a relationship between political systems and the tendency toward populism on the other hand, and the question and the question I ask myself is whether winner-takes-all systems sort of favor more radical policies or populism more generally?
Okay, let's take a few other ones. Atishi?
Hi, my question is, I guess, to both of you about on what we have been discussing, and I think that populism personally is a very worrying subject for me because I think we see similar trends in India in the past couple of years. And I wonder whether this rise of what you've called illiberal populism is actually, it represents the failure of our conception of a liberal democracy. And how many of the things that we regard as central to a liberal democracy, like an independent media, an independent judiciary, something like an election commission, these are also elite institutions. These are elite institutions that ordinary citizens don't actually relate to. And when they get taken over by different political parties or populist leaders, then ordinary citizens at the best don't care, and at the worst actually rejoice at the taking over of these institutions. And I think that maybe it's the fact that a lot of our liberal democracies have not been able to address what are the very real bread and butter issues of people, that there are no jobs, or that people are losing jobs, that there's no proper education, there's no health care, that these real issues have not been addressed. And that is why we see this upsurge towards leaders who claim to have all the solutions. And so that's number one. Number two, my question is whether our fundamental premise of a liberal democracy is flawed, that we think that a voter is making a rational choice and expressing their interests. Whereas I think the more I see politics, the more I'm convinced about the fact that a vote is often an expression of emotion than a rational choice. And you have, across the board, I'll share some of my own personal experiences later on today, how people vote against their own interests. And I wonder whether the solution eventually is not to look at a lot of these institutions like judiciary, media, but to really, if we want to deepen democracy, is to look at how we can engage citizens on what are like the bread and butter issues of their lives, around jobs, around education, around sort of community participation, some of these things, to help move their identity from being someone who can vote on the basis of their religion or their community to being someone who wants to vote on the basis of, would this party give me a better school? Would they give me a proper job?
Okay, Andrei?
I think it has been the darkest session so far, and I'm trying to get rid of this feeling. First, I was surprised that you did not mention or you did not talk much about the new technologies and their role in this rise of populism. So I wonder, did you deliberately leave it for the tomorrow's session?
Yes,
that
we
Frank
did.
is going to
Yeah,
have?
we're gonna have a whole session devoted
But maybe
to...
if you have something to say, should we see this new technology, the technological revolution as an essential part of this rise of populism, or is it something that we saw 100 years ago and centuries ago? Second, kind of like a provocation, do you see space for positive, noble, righteous populism? I think in many countries, the idea to get rid of this corrupt elite and crush the existing not fair institutions might seem to be a good cause to follow. And also something which Belabas mentioned, can we see changes of electoral systems as a way to fix these problems? I thought of Australia, which has quite an interesting electoral system, which kind of like leaves aside marginal groups and populist groups and tends to give prizes to centrist parties. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I would like to ask this question to Frank and Larry as well. Is it populism arise because of we see the failure of democracy in practice to address certain humanity issues, communitarian issues, which to a certain extent make the practice of democracy disconnected to the very habit of the heart of the people, which to a certain extent respond to what is happening in the surrounding area, be it in the rural area or in the city. So is it about that, or populism arises because of by design, because someone tried to take advantage of the gap in the democracy practice, or the democracy practice itself failed to address? I try to identify two issues: communitarian issues and the humanity issues.
Why don't we take
Okay, you want to
that?
start? or
No,
you want me
you
to?
can start.
So I can combine the question from Belabas with one of the questions from Andre and say that I do think that there are institutional properties of a democracy that can make them more vulnerable to the dangers of illiberal populism in particular. One is when the electoral system permits the exaggeration or inflation of a plurality or small majority into a large majority. You know, in one sense, that could be a good thing if you're worried about governability, which Frank certainly has been. And if you're worried about vetocracy, which is a major theme of Volume 2 of Political Order, Frank's magisterial work, then you might like certain empowerment of a majority to get things done. And let's keep in mind, you could see, you didn't make this point, Frank, so I'll ask a question to you. Is the problem of vetocracy one of the contributing factors to the rise of Trump? And the sense that democracy isn't working in the United States, it's dysfunctional, Congress can't get anything done, maybe we need a strong leader. But on the other hand, when a strong leader is empowered politically in this way, it can be a very dangerous thing. Now, just note that there's a bizarre feature of the Turkish constitution, of the Turkish electoral system, put in place by the military as a result of the political fragmentation of the pre-1983 era, that imposes the highest electoral threshold that I think exists in any proportional representation system in the world, 10%. So a lot of smaller parties couldn't clear the threshold, and this inflated the majority of the AKP and gave Erdogan much more parliamentary power than he otherwise would have had. Anything that distorts electoral representation and rules in ways that can be abused by authoritarians, populist or not, I think is a danger. Then Andre mentioned the Australian electoral system, which is used to elect the lower house of parliament, which is ranked choice voting, the alternative vote. Frank was smiling when you asked your question because he knew what my answer was going to be. We are very polarized in the United States between blue and red, Democrat and Republican, to some extent more ideologically than before. And I think that we need to look for ways that can induce moderation and the aggregation of interests and the assembling of broader majorities. So anything that can induce that and make it more difficult for temporary minorities that are seeking to leverage anger and emotion, if I can put it that way, to ride to electoral power, and that require appeal to broader constituencies, I think is something we really ought to look at seriously. If you don't know, ranked choice voting is a system. It can actually happen in multi-member districts using proportional representation. Then it's called the single transferable vote, and that's how Ireland elects its lower house of parliament. In Australia, it happens with the majoritarian system of single-member districts. But you don't just vote for a single party or candidate. You rank the available parties and candidates. And then if nobody gets a majority, the lowest number of first place votes, that candidate is eliminated, and their votes are transferred to their second preferences. And that keeps happening until somebody gets a majority or nobody else is remaining. Actually, Britain had a referendum on this electoral system, and unfortunately, in my view, it didn't pass. I think Britain would have a better democracy if it had, and we would too. You should know that the state of Maine, last November 2016, became the first American state to adopt by referendum, although it's been challenged in the courts, ranked choice voting. And as of now, this will be the system that will be used to elect members of Congress from Maine in 2016. Let me say one other thing with respect to the US about this, and then I want to respond to at least one other comment from Atishi. If ranked choice voting had been used in the Republican primaries, and so in each state, voters for the 16, keep in mind when this thing started, 16 different Republican candidates. That's important to keep in mind in terms of the rise of Donald Trump, because there were the 15 dwarfs and the one populist. And so he was able to easily distinguish himself from everybody else. But if there'd been ranked choice voting, I am reasonably confident, and more importantly, people who are really expert on American politics strongly believe that Trump would not have gotten the Republican nomination. And of course, please keep in mind, if you're talking about institutions, if we didn't have the bizarre anachronism of the Electoral College in the United States, with everything that happened, all the anger, all the Russian intervention, which we haven't even talked about yet, all the distortions in this last election, if we didn't have the Electoral College, Trump would not have been elected president. In general, I would say that when power is dispersed through proportional representation, parliamentary rules, strong constraints on the abuse of power, strong constitutional courts, and I think you'll know now, having been through our program, agencies of horizontal accountability. These present checks on the potential for populist concentration of power. I just want to say one thing in response to Atishi, and this was stimulated by our previous conversation, so I think you can anticipate what I'm going to say. Frank has read this book too, and I know shares my respect for it, I think. There have been three important books, I think, about the raw material for populism in the United States, all of which were published before the rise of the election of Donald Trump in November of last year. I can give you the other two later, but one in particular I want to mention now is a really remarkable book by the Berkeley sociologist Arlie Hochschild called Strangers in Their Own Land. This is a really deep and I think revealing ethnographic account of the frustration that Frank was talking about. And the important point is these people feel they've been treated very unfairly, that there is a line for the American dream that they've been standing in front of, and people are cutting in front of them in the line. And without further elaborating on that or taking more time, I'll just close by saying that we, liberal elites, so I'm now talking to myself, but in a way collectively to all of us, first of all need to develop some empathy for these people. Empathy is different than sympathy. We don't have to agree with any of their racist or illiberal tendencies, but we need to get inside their minds and understand their thought process, their emotions, and their grievances. And we need to develop a language that can speak to them that is not a liberal, effete, intellectual abstract, type of plane of argument. One of you was saying in the context of your own country, and you'll know who you are, you were talking about somebody from your country who is a very admirable liberal intellectual who was going on about the need to address the authoritarian situation, but kind of losing an opportunity because he was arguing in such an abstract intellectual vein. That's not going to engage these people. And we really need to get our hands dirty. And Hillary Clinton lost the 2016 election because she didn't do that. She couldn't find a language to do that. And she literally didn't do that. She didn't go to these constituencies, and she didn't see what was brewing.
So responding to Atishi, so the institutions are elite, but no institution actually works successfully unless it's supported politically. So greatest example of that was what happened in Poland when the current government tried to basically pack the Supreme Court and the court system. Million Poles came out and demonstrated against that. And that's what really forced, I think, President Duda to then back away from that. So essentially, it's all politics in the end. Institutions aren't these independent things that somehow exist independently of the kind of popular support they can get. Are voters rational? No. There's what's the name of the book? That was Larry
Bartels and Christopher Aiken.
Yeah. So if you really want to be depressed about democracy, you should read this book because it goes over a huge amount of political science data, asking this basic question: do voters understand issues? Do they vote on the basis of issues? Do they hold politicians accountable? And the broad answer is no. I mean, they vote on the basis of emotions. Hopefully, and that's why I think the American founding fathers actually worried about people voting for the wrong candidates. And that's why every modern democratic system has also got these elite controls built into it. In fact, that's why the Electoral College is there, because the founding fathers didn't trust direct democracy. They didn't think that the people would choose correctly all the time. On Yusmati's question, is it a failure of democracy to deliver? I would say yes. I mean, that's actually the point I started out with, and I didn't emphasize that strongly enough. The elites in the United States screwed up big time with the 2008 financial crisis. They created the conditions for the crisis. It hurt a lot of ordinary Americans, and they didn't suffer all that much. Wall Street, these big banks all bounced back within 2 or 3 years. I think the European Union has screwed up, big time institutionally as well. And I think the euro was a big mistake right from the get-go, and it's one that's not been corrected. And then you have this problem of migration, which has not been solved. So this is the point where it's a little dangerous, because if you say something that Viktor Orban has said, you get, people look at you funny. But every now and then, just like Donald Trump, he says something that is correct, which is you cannot have the Schengen system of free movement within the Schengen zone if you do not have secure outer borders. And Europe doesn't have secure outer borders, and again, that's another big failure that they have not, they've not addressed. So, Andre, on the question, of course there's good populism. So in the 1930s, you had a huge economic depression, you had huge mobilization of angry people, and then you had the luck of having Franklin Roosevelt as president. And by the way, Roosevelt had some of these quasi-authoritarian tendencies. When the Supreme Court invalidated a lot of the early New Deal legislation, he tried to do what these Argentine presidents do, is pack the Supreme Court, and he only stopped because there was a lot of popular, opposition to that. But he actually, for the most part, had good policies, and you wouldn't have had the modern American welfare state if you hadn't had a visionary leader that could mobilize popular anger, and unlike Donald Trump, put it in, towards positive institutional changes rather than negative ones. All right, we've got 11 minutes left, so we'll open it up for another, Elena.
Thank you. We've been talking a lot about leadership, but I want you to ask and maybe to talk a little bit about people. Because if just ordinary citizens are not going to support such populistic leaders, we are not going to have them in power. But I can watch that in reality problems, they didn't change. We still have and we had before, medical care problem, education, taxation, and so on. But people, they changed. Maybe we have this moral crisis or something like this because it's unlimited consumption, it's promotion through the media, through cinema and many other things, different values, and it leads to the tremendous high expectations from the politicians. And I want you to comment on this about just ordinary citizens. Thank you.
Okay, let's. Jovan.
It's easy to find many of the traits of the liberal populism you both laid in the Western Balkans and Serbia, but mostly the anti-pluralism, anti-institutionalism, and hegemonic tendencies. But I wanted to ask you something about your northern neighbor, about Canada. What is the influence of Canadian model in the United States? And because this Trudeau's regime is frequently portrayed in rosy colors, whether do you see also some grains of populism also in Canada? Thank you.
Okay, Julian.
Where do you place United Kingdom on this scale of populism? There are no specific illiberal populists behind Brexit vote, but still in the public space we've seen lots of features that Larry has outlined early, like violence against immigrants and even the murder of a British MP. So that's the question.
Well, we're honored to have the British ambassador sitting right in the room with us, so there may be a more appropriate person to answer that one. All right, let's, Salima.
In the populism system, we expect that the free market should exist, like free entry, free exit, and everyone, the market system should participate. But especially in SAARC region, we have seen that there might be, popular leader, and according to them, it is free market. But when there is tender or other government procurement, it is not actually free market. So in that circumstance, how do you define, populism or the liberal democracy? Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my understanding is that you have a good presidential campaign mechanism to some extent, and this mechanism brought Donald Trump and brought Trump in free and fair election. So this, what you considered as a mistake by many American scholars, why you don't revisit the idea that United States interference outside its land, it might also entail some mistakes. If you don't understand the dynamics, your own political dynamic inside, probably it means that you don't understand the world outside. And this you should revisit as scholars and think that yes, we might have been doing mistakes somewhere, in the past. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Laura.
I wanted to ask you about media and polarization, because although if you turn on the TV, you see a lot of face politics, and you get the feeling that in the developed world, societies are more and more polarized. Polls show that people still place themselves in the middle of the spectrum, not at the polls. And I wanted to, because Larry made the comment about the polarized society in the United States, whether that's true, or not, whether we're living in a more polarized world or not. And if people still place themselves in the middle, how can we do to tap into those people?
Okay. All right, I think,
You want to start?
okay. So Elena's question, maybe it's the people that are wrong. I was actually in a debate in China where I was complaining about the elites and the bad emperor problem, and this Chinese responded and said, yeah, well, in your democracy, you've got a bad people that vote for bad leaders. You know, I don't think that there's, so first of all, what's interpreted as bad choices by democratic publics actually oftentimes reflects something real going on. So even if voters are not informed and are voting according to emotion, they're still reflecting something in their lives that they're unhappy about. And I think, you know, the democratic system is actually good in revealing that. And so the Trump election revealed that we've got this big problem with this old working class in the United States that people, you know, hadn't been taking seriously. And even if the populist leader doesn't have a good solution to that, at least it's on the agenda now, and people understand that they need to, you know, to deal with the underlying problem. And so maybe in a later iteration they'll get that right. I don't know what the answer to the Canada, I mean, Americans aren't even aware that Canada is a separate country for the most part. So I'm not quite sure whether it, in their minds, represents, you know, an actual alternative model. But it is worthwhile thinking, you know, they've become much more multicultural in a certain sense than the United States, and yet they've not experienced this, whether that's related to the fact that they've done better economically than the US over the past decade. I don't know the answer. I'm going to punt on the UK question because, Madam Ambassador, you can respond to that if you choose. Salima's question about the free market. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, so procurement, corruption, yeah, I mean, corruption is one of the biggest drivers of populist movements everywhere. And corruption exists everywhere. And so it's, you know, in a sense, that's another area where people are responding to genuine unhappiness about the system. And again, it really depends on how that anger gets translated. In terms of Laura's question about about polarization, there are specific institutions that promote polarization. So we'll talk about the media at much greater length tomorrow. That's been one of them. But for example, the American move towards direct primaries since the 1970s has contributed to polarization because it turns out that the people who vote in primary elections tend to be activists who are more extreme in their views than the median voters. So in the Republican Party, the people that vote in primaries are the Tea Party voters. And that's why they threaten more mainstream Republicans every single election cycle. And something similar is now happening with the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. So if we allowed the parties to choose candidates like we did up until the 1970s, both parties would choose much more moderate centrist candidates, but the system has been driven, you know, towards the extremes by this particular thing that was supposed to increase levels of popular participation, and in a strange way it kind of did the opposite. I think Larry's electoral reforms would get at some of that problem also, because this two-party system we have kind of hollows out the middle.
Yeah, well, I can continue on the institutional reform front. I could have said other things. One of them, it's a small contribution to the problem in the US, but it's not to be ignored. When you gerrymander electoral districts for partisan advantage and create uncompetitive districts, you tend to worsen the ideological polarization problem, because when a district is a swing district, the person who gets elected is more likely to be a little bit more ideologically flexible, because if they're too extreme, they're going to lose the district to the opposition candidate. Whereas if it's a safe district in a partisan sense, all they have to do is win their primary and then they're elected. So there's also a movement against gerrymandering in the United States, and it's very important that you all know that there's a case going to the Supreme Court of the United States this October, challenging the electoral district plan that was adopted in 2010 for the state of Wisconsin, saying it's unconstitutional because it's so severely gerrymandered, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think that I should come back and answer the question Andre asked about technology. We have had populism, and by the way, we've had social movements and, in a way, color revolutions before there was social media. So we can't really say that this is a phenomenon of the information and communications technological revolution. I think it's being quickened by it. I think it's being facilitated by it, but it's something that's existed for a long time. I just want to add one more kind of word about what Frank said about good populism. I think that there can be populist elements. There can be a populist touch. We've had a lot of presidents in the United States. I would even say Obama was one who had a certain populist touch, and Reagan also, in terms of mobilizing and speaking to deep currents of public dissatisfaction and then responding to them with policies. But you know, when they don't decimate and denigrate institutions, they don't threaten democracy. So there's a line there, and that's where I would draw the boundary. I will answer the question about the UK in all humility. I think that UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, has a lot of the features of illiberal populism that we see on the European continent and elsewhere as well. And I think it's got some troubling elements, and you know, these injected themselves into the Brexit campaign. Now, I think there were a lot of people who voted for Brexit who, you know, had a kind of rational attitude here and felt it wasn't just a kind of an emotional vote. There was a reflective element to it. Julian, I've answered your question. So I've answered the question about polarization. One more question I want to answer, and that's about institutions. I think that, you know, because I've said a lot about institutions of horizontal accountability, which by design and by definition float above popular politics, electoral politics, and vertical accountability. You can see these as elitist and as natural targets for populist contempt and mobilization. But I don't think it's inevitable that they wind up being that way. And I'll just close with two examples. One is Brazil, where I'd say the single most popular and admired kind of public political figure in the country today is the prosecutor who's just winding up his role in this, who has been prosecuting all this corruption. And when people see the system working for justice, you know, fairness, justice, dignity, these are basic things that people want from their political system. And when people see the system working for that, I think it does strengthen the institutions of horizontal accountability and provide an antidote to illiberal populism. And finally, the institutions of horizontal accountability, including the judiciary, by the way, have a certain responsibility to engage and educate the public. And a lot of the leading jurists in the United States, including the chief justices of the United States over time increasingly, have taken on a certain educative role in terms of public opinion, in terms of speaking and whatnot. They have to be very careful about that because they don't want to be political. But they do understand, and the best agencies counter-corruption agencies in the world know that a public education and outreach function is very important to their work, that if you don't have popular support for these institutions, they're not going to function and they're not going to survive.
Okay, that's it. We take a break now, is that right? No, we have a, okay. No, we don't take a break. We move on to the next.
Okay, so unfortunately, a couple of our alumni who were supposed to present next could not make it here today, but we have a little surprise. Our communications manager, Georgia Podesky, was hard at work over the past 6 weeks or so producing a short promotional video on the Draper Hill Summer Fellows program. It's the first time we've had the capacity at CDDRL to produce something, and so we thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to debut it here. We will be opening our applications in September, actually probably quite soon after we return home, and so we're going to be using this video, and it will be hopefully being pushed out on the web and social media. So without further ado, I will introduce our first video. The Draper Hill Summer Fellows program at Stanford Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law is a very unique program. There's nothing else like it inside of academia.
You can think of it as an executive training program for people who are going to make a difference to democracy, development, and the rule of law in their countries.
I think it's very important because these people are really the ones that are going to shape the future of politics around the world. If you want to change the world, you have to begin with people. You have to begin with human capital and their knowledge and their dedication.
And they had this opportunity, a very unique opportunity, to come to this beautiful campus in the heart of Silicon Valley for 3 weeks to engage with leading academics in the field of political science, social science, to engage with former policymakers, to visit technology firms, and to really, I think, emerge from the experience with new practices and foundations of knowledge about how to accelerate and deepen their work.
One of the things that we've been trying to do, especially in our alumni network, is to take many of the fellows who are part of civil society. They belong to nonprofit organizations or advocacy groups, and persuade them that they actually need to go into politics, they need to go into the government, because democracy is not just about opposing a dictator, a tyrant, getting the authoritarian leader out of power. It really is also about democratically governing. That means democratically exercising power in the interests of the people.
In Ukraine, for example, we had a number of fellows who came to our program and are now in the Ukrainian parliament. One's even the Ukrainian ambassador to Canada. And I like to think that some of the things that they learned in our program, they're actually able to put into action.
The intensity of this program creates relationships that are different than any other program in the world. I know some of the fellows from the first couple of years. I still am in touch with them. They're still doing good work. Something special about being a Draper Hills Fellow, and there's something special about this experience that inspires them through the long haul.
One thing we share throughout the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law is a very deep conviction that individuals can make a difference. You take someone like Rafael Marques of Angola, you know, a country that is really one of the most corrupt and oppressive in the world, but there he is, relentless, working to expose wrongdoing and bring about change. Take Maina Kiai, who I think is one of the bravest and most forthright advocates of democracy, good governance, and civil liberties in Kenya. We think about Laura Alonso, who was a legislator and is now the head of the anti-corruption administration in Argentina.
So for me, it's always been a collaborative experience. And in this process, and I'm sure many fellows would share this, we've had a lot of failures. And when I see the fellows coming in every year, I see a group of fellows that has been very successful, but also risked enough to have failed. And they are the fellows that we're looking for, not the ones who are going to succeed all the time.
And therefore, I think it's all the more important to keep this program developing and to keep it engaged in the world, because these are harder times than they were just when we began the program.
This wouldn't be possible without a lot of generous support, particularly from Ingrid Hills and Bill and Phyllis Draper, the people after whom the program is named, and their support has really been critical, but there have been a number of others also that have been very, very generous in offering support, I think.
So we go for a break and we come back in 15 minutes. See you in 15 minutes.